A crisp autumn wind brushed through the streets, and the girl clutched her books tightly as she stepped out of the small cafe near her school. She had saved her allowance for weeks to buy her favorite novel and was excited to finally have it in her bag. With a few crumpled dollars still in her hand, she paused near the counter, deciding whether to grab a coffee for her walk home. That's when she noticed him. A tall, uniformed police officer leaned against the doorway, his gaze fixed on her like a predator locking on to prey. She felt the weight of his stare but tried to ignore it, forcing herself to focus on the cashier's smile as she handed over her money. She barely got 3 steps out the door when his voice stopped her cold. "Hey, you!" His tone was sharp, cutting through the casual chatter of the cafe. Heads turned. Her heart raced. "Come here." Confused, but taught to respect authority, she obeyed. "Is something wrong, officer?" Her voice was soft but steady, trying to mask the growing knot of fear in her chest. "You tell me," he sneered, his eyes narrowing as he gestured toward her backpack. "What's in there?" "Just my books and schoolwork," she answered, her tone polite despite the unease creeping in. He didn't even ask permission before yanking the bag from her shoulder. He rifled through it, tossing her notebook and papers onto the ground as other cafe patrons looked on. No one stepped forward. "Looks like you're carrying a lot of cash for a high schooler," he said, pulling out the few remaining dollars she had in her pocket. "Where'd you get this?" "You steal it?" Her face burned. "No, sir. That's my allowance. I saved it." "Allowance? A girl like you walking around with cash like this?" He cut her off with a bitter laugh, holding the bills up for everyone to see. "Funny how kids from your kind of neighborhood always have money they can't explain." Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She could hear whispers from the people inside the cafe, see their judgment in their faces, but not one of them spoke up. The humiliation was suffocating. "Let me guess," the officer continued, now speaking louder for his impromptu audience. "You thought you'd just wander in here, flash your stolen cash, and no one would notice, huh?" "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice breaking as she reached for the money. But he stepped back, holding it just out of reach. "Sure you didn't," he muttered, pocketing the cash like it was evidence of a crime. "Consider this a lesson, stay out of places you don't belong." She watched, stunned, as he turned and walked back to his patrol car, her money still in his hand. The cafe had gone eerily quiet. She stood frozen in place, the cold wind stinging her cheeks as the weight of what just happened settled in. The humiliation. The injustice. The overwhelming sense of powerlessness. But just as she started to pick up her scattered belongings, she heard a voice, a calm, steady voice that sent a shiver down her spine. "Excuse me, officer." The tone was polite, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. A man in a sharp suit had appeared seemingly out of nowhere, his badge glinting subtly in the afternoon light. The officer turned, his smug grin faltering ever so slightly. "Who are you?" the officer asked, his bravado wavering. "I'm someone you're going to wish you hadn't messed with," the man replied, his voice deadly calm. His gaze flicked to the girl, then back to the officer. "Let's talk about that money you just stole." The officer's smirk vanished as the man stepped closer, pulling out his phone. "Because, you see, I've been watching this entire interaction. And I think it's time we set a few things straight." The air seemed to crackle with tension as the cafe patrons shifted uncomfortably, sensing the storm that was about to unfold. The officer's bravado gave way to a thinly veiled panic, but the man wasn't done yet. "You picked the wrong day," the man said, his voice low but seething. "And the wrong person to humiliate." What happened next would not only turn the tables on the arrogant officer but leave everyone who witnessed it utterly speechless. The balance of power was about to shift, and justice was coming in a way no one could have predicted. But how far would this confrontation go? And what consequences would it bring? Stay tuned to uncover the jaw-dropping twists that no one saw coming. This is a story you won't want to miss. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. This channel is a safe space for powerful stories that inspire change, justice, and empathy. To all our Black viewers watching today, we see you, we support you, and we honor your strength and resilience. Your voices matter. Get ready for a story that challenges injustice and delivers a shocking twist of karma. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to stay tuned for more impactful narratives. Let's dive in. Enjoy the story. The day had started like any other for Amara Jones. At 16, she was the kind of teenager everyone at her high school admired, though she never sought the spotlight. Her sharp mind and quiet resilience made her stand out, even when she tried to blend in. She spent her mornings studying diligently, her afternoons juggling basketball practice and tutoring sessions, and her evenings helping her younger brother, Malik, with his homework. Amara lived with her family in a modest, two-bedroom apartment on the east side of Atlanta, a neighborhood brimming with culture and community but often overshadowed by stories of hardship. The apartment, though small, was filled with warmth and the smell of her mother's cooking, a sanctuary from the challenges of the outside world. Her father, Elijah Jones, was a federal agent with the FBI, a man of integrity, feared by some but deeply loved by his family. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that Amara had always admired, though his job often kept him busy and away from home. Elijah was known for his tenacity. He had risen through the ranks of the Bureau, breaking barriers and earning respect in an institution that hadn't always been welcoming to Black men in leadership. His dedication to justice inspired Amara, shaping her dream of one day becoming a lawyer. But more than anything, she cherished the rare moments he could be home, sitting at the kitchen table and talking with her about the world. He always reminded her of the importance of standing up for what was right. This particular Friday afternoon was supposed to be a small celebration for Amara. She had just aced a major history exam, and her teacher had pulled her aside to commend her for her thoughtful essay about civil rights movements. Beaming with pride, she decided to reward herself with a stop at a quaint cafe near the school. She'd been eyeing a novel for weeks at the bookstore across the street and finally had enough saved to buy it. Amara's best friend, Tasha, had invited her to hang out that evening, but Amara wanted some quiet time. She planned to spend the night curled up with her new book while Malik told her about his science project. Tasha had laughed, teasing her for being such a homebody, but Amara didn't mind. Her life might not have been flashy, but it was hers, and she liked it that way. As she stepped into the cafe, Amara felt the comforting buzz of students chatting and the hiss of an espresso machine. She exchanged a few pleasantries with the barista, a friendly college student she saw often on her walks home. After paying for a chai latte, she placed her remaining dollars carefully into her wallet, feeling the satisfying weight of her well-earned money. Across the cafe, Officer Greg Matheson leaned against the wall, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Matheson was a veteran cop in the neighborhood, but not the kind anyone trusted. He had a reputation for throwing his weight around, especially when it came to people who didn't look like him. Amara had seen him before, patrolling the streets, always with a scowl or a sarcastic comment directed at the kids in her neighborhood. But she never imagined she'd end up in his sights. Matheson's career had been marked by controversy. He prided himself on keeping the streets clean, a euphemism for targeting Black and brown teenagers with baseless accusations. His colleagues often turned a blind eye to his behavior, either out of fear or complicity. Matheson, however, believed himself untouchable, a man of authority who answered to no one. Today, as he watched Amara pay for her latte, something about her presence set him off. Amara was gathering her belongings when she noticed Matheson staring at her. She felt a chill run down her spine but told herself not to overthink it. She tucked her wallet into her bag, slung it over her shoulder, and headed for the door, her heart already envisioning the relaxing evening ahead. "Hey, you!" Matheson's voice cut through the air like a blade, stopping Amara in her tracks. She turned slowly, unsure if he was speaking to her. But his gaze was fixed firmly on her, his lips curling into a smirk that made her stomach twist. "Me?" she asked hesitantly. "Yeah, you," he said, pushing himself off the wall and sauntering toward her. "Got a minute?" Amara's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" "That depends," he said, his eyes narrowing. "What's in the bag?" Confused, Amara hugged her backpack closer. "Just my schoolbooks and a novel I just bought," she said, trying to maintain eye contact despite the growing unease in her chest. "Mind if I take a look?" Matheson didn't wait for a response before snatching the bag from her hands. His actions drew the attention of other customers, but no one said anything. They just watched as he dumped the contents of her bag onto a nearby table, scattering her books, notebooks, and papers across the surface. "Hey!" Amara protested, reaching for her belongings, but Matheson held up a hand to stop her. "Don't get smart with me," he barked. His hand darted into her bag again, pulling out her wallet. He opened it and thumbed through her cash, shaking his head with mock disapproval. "What's a kid like you doing with this much money, huh? You steal it?" Amara felt her cheeks flush with humiliation. "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice trembling. "That's my allowance. I saved it for weeks." Matheson laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "Allowance, huh? That's a good one. Let me guess, you thought you could waltz in here, buy yourself a latte, and no one would notice." Tears stung her eyes as she looked around the cafe, silently pleading for someone to intervene. But the other patrons avoided her gaze, their faces etched with discomfort but unwilling to get involved. "Look, I didn't do anything wrong," Amara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I please just have my things back?" Matheson ignored her, stuffing the cash into his pocket. "Consider this a lesson," he said coldly. "Stay in your lane." As he turned and walked toward the door, Amara stood frozen, the weight of the humiliation pressing down on her like a stone. The cafe was silent, save for the whispers of the onlookers who still refused to meet her eyes. She felt exposed, powerless, and utterly alone. But the silence didn't last long. A new voice cut through the air, calm but firm. "Excuse me, officer." Amara turned, her tear-streaked face meeting the steady gaze of a man in a dark suit. His presence was commanding, his tone low but charged with authority. She recognized him immediately. It was her father. Amara's father, Elijah, had always been a man who chose his words carefully. His presence alone often did the work of a raised voice or a clenched fist. Standing in the cafe, he surveyed the scene, Amara's scattered belongings, the wide-eyed patrons, and the smug officer standing by the door. It didn't take a detective to piece together what had just happened. "Excuse me, officer," Elijah repeated, his voice measured, almost calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge. Matheson turned, his smirk faltering as he took in the man approaching him. Elijah wasn't in uniform, but everything about him, the tailored suit, the authoritative stance, the sharp, unyielding eyes, radiated power. Matheson sized him up quickly, his defensive posture betraying his uncertainty. "Can I help you?" Matheson asked, the arrogance in his tone barely masking his unease. "I'm Elijah Jones," he said, his voice steady. He gestured toward Amara, who stood rooted to the spot, her face still streaked with tears. "That's my daughter." Matheson glanced at Amara, then back at Elijah, the realization dawning on him. "Oh, well," he started, clearing his throat. "Your daughter was acting suspiciously. I was just doing my job, by humiliating a teenage girl and stealing her money." Elijah's tone didn't rise, but the accusation landed like a punch. The cafe seemed to hold its collective breath. "I didn't steal anything," Matheson snapped, his face flushing. "I confiscated the money because you assumed she had no right to it," Elijah interrupted, stepping closer. His height and composed demeanor made Matheson seem small, though the officer tried to stand his ground. Because you saw a black girl with cash and decided that made her a criminal. Matheson's mouth opened, then closed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not like this. Look, Matheson finally said, attempting to regain his composure, if this is about the money, we can. This isn't just about the money, Elijah cut in, his voice sharper now. It's about the abuse of power. It's about you targeting my daughter because you thought no one would hold you accountable. Amara watched, her heart pounding. She'd seen her father handle tense situations before. He'd told her stories about interrogations and negotiations during his time with the Bureau, but this was different. This wasn't just about his work. This was about her. Officer, Elijah continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm, I'm going to give you one chance to return what you took and apologize. Right here. Right now. Matheson hesitated, his eyes darting around the cafe. The tension in the room was palpable, the silence pressing in from all sides. I don't take orders from civilians, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he didn't lose his composure. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his badge. I'm not just a civilian, he said, holding it up for Matheson to see. Special Agent Elijah Jones, FBI. The color drained from Matheson's face. He blinked, his confidence unraveling as the badge's weight seemed to crush whatever bravado he had left. He stammered, I didn't know, you didn't know who she was, Elijah finished for him, his voice cutting like a blade. But you knew exactly what you were doing. Amara stepped closer, her voice trembling but firm. You didn't even give me a chance to explain. You just assumed I was guilty. The cafe patrons, emboldened by Elijah's presence, began murmuring among themselves. A woman near the counter pulled out her phone, clearly recording the interaction. Matheson noticed, his panic deepening. Sir, Matheson started, his tone pleading now, I think we can work this out. There's no need to, there's every need, Elijah snapped, his patience thinning. What you did to my daughter is not going to be brushed under the rug. I'm reporting this incident to your precinct, and you can be sure it won't end there. Matheson looked like he might protest, but he thought better of it. Reluctantly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled bills, handing them to Elijah without meeting his eyes. Elijah passed the money back to Amara, his expression softening as he turned to her. Are you okay? He asked gently. Amara nodded, though her hands trembled as she clutched the bills. Yeah, she whispered, though the lingering humiliation still stung. Elijah turned back to Matheson, his expression hardening again. You owe her an apology. Matheson hesitated, glancing at the recording phone before muttering, I'm sorry. Look at her when you say it, Elijah demanded. Matheson swallowed hard, finally lifting his eyes to meet Amara's. I'm sorry, he said, the words forced and hollow. Not good enough, Elijah said, his tone icy. But it'll do for now. The officer looked like he wanted to crawl out of his own skin, but Elijah wasn't done. You're going to hear from Internal Affairs, he said firmly. And if I find out you've done anything like this before, and I will find out, you can kiss your badge goodbye. Matheson didn't respond. He couldn't. His career, his reputation, and his unchecked power, all of it was suddenly hanging by a thread. Elijah turned to Amara, placing a hand on her shoulder. Let's go, he said softly, guiding her toward the door. As they stepped outside, the weight of the moment hit her all over again, but this time, she didn't feel alone. In the car, silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Elijah glanced at her, his face etched with both anger and concern. You did nothing wrong, he said firmly. I want you to remember that. I know, Amara said quietly, her voice steadying. But he's going to get away with it, isn't he? Even with everything you said, Elijah's grip on the steering wheel tightened. We'll see about that, he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Amara didn't know what he meant, but there was a determination in his voice that told her the confrontation in the cafe was just the beginning. As the car sped toward home, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that her father had plans to ensure justice, plans that would change everything. And she was right. The storm was only just beginning. The following Monday morning, the tension in the Jones household was almost palpable. Amara sat at the breakfast table, poking at her cereal. She hadn't been able to shake the memory of what had happened in the cafe. Her father had been uncharacteristically quiet all weekend, his usual comforting presence overshadowed by a simmering anger he couldn't quite conceal. "Elijah, you're not eating," Amara's mom, Lisa, said, breaking the silence. "I'm not hungry," Elijah replied curtly, his eyes fixed on his phone. He'd been making calls and sending emails non-stop since the incident, though he hadn't shared much about what he was planning. All Amara knew was that her father didn't let things like this slide. Lisa exchanged a glance with Amara, her expression a mix of concern and frustration. "You've been locked in your office all weekend. Maybe we need to, I'm handling it, Lisa," Elijah interrupted, his tone firm but not harsh. "This isn't something we can just let go." Amara hesitated, then finally spoke. "Dad, is this going to change anything? I mean, really change anything? People like Matheson don't just get what they deserve." Elijah looked up from his phone, his gaze steady. "Sometimes they do," he said simply. There was something in his voice, an edge, a certainty, that made Amara sit up straighter. Before she could ask what he meant, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening. "I have to go," he said, standing and grabbing his jacket. "Where?" Lisa asked, crossing her arms. "Elijah, if you're going to get involved in something dangerous, it's not dangerous," he reassured her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's justice. Trust me." Amara watched as he kissed Lisa on the forehead and left, his stride purposeful. She wanted to believe him, but the knot in her stomach told her this wasn't going to be simple. Later that day, Elijah walked into the precinct where Officer Matheson worked. He'd been there before on other cases, but this time, he wasn't there as a bureau agent. He was there as a father. The front desk officer barely looked up. "Can I help you?" "I need to speak with your captain," Elijah said, his voice steady. "Do you have an appointment?" Elijah pulled out his badge and placed it on the counter. "No. But he'll want to see me." The officer's eyes widened slightly, and after a brief hesitation, she picked up the phone. Moments later, Elijah was escorted into Captain Russo's office. The captain, a burly man with salt and pepper hair, stood as Elijah entered. "Agent Jones," Russo said, extending a hand. "What brings you here?" Elijah didn't take the offered handshake. Instead, he placed a file on the desk between them. "This," he said. Russo frowned, sitting back down and opening the file. His eyes scanned the contents, his expression darkening with each page. "What is this?" he asked finally, though the question seemed rhetorical. "It's a detailed record of Officer Matheson's misconduct," Elijah replied. "Documented complaints, internal memos that were conveniently ignored, and witness statements. You'll notice that many of these incidents involve young black and brown people from this community." Russo closed the file, leaning back in his chair. "And what exactly are you expecting me to do with this?" "Start by suspending Matheson," Elijah said, his tone calm but firm. "Then launch a formal investigation. If you don't, I'll take this to the press." Russo's jaw tightened. "You're putting me in a tough position, Jones." "No," Elijah said, leaning forward. "Matheson put you in this position. I'm just giving you the opportunity to do the right thing." The room was silent for a long moment. Russo finally exhaled and nodded. "I'll take care of it." Meanwhile, Matheson was out on patrol, blissfully unaware of what was unfolding back at the precinct. He was cruising through a neighborhood he often targeted, feeling untouchable as always. But then his radio crackled to life. "Matheson, return to the station immediately," a voice said. "Why?" "I'm in the middle of something," Matheson replied, annoyed. "That's an order." Matheson cursed under his breath and turned the car around. When he arrived at the station, he was met with cold stares from his colleagues. It was unusual. Normally, they greeted him with nods of approval or casual banter. Today, it was as if they knew something he didn't. "What's going on?" Matheson muttered as he made his way to Rousseau's office. When he walked in, Rousseau was waiting for him, and so was Elijah. Matheson froze in the doorway. "What's he doing here?" Matheson asked, his voice rising. "Sit down," Rousseau said sharply. Matheson hesitated, then "Saturday, what's this about?" Rousseau slid the file across the desk toward him. "Take a look." Matheson opened it, his face growing pale as he realized what it contained. This is ridiculous," he sputtered. "It's all lies." "Is it?" Elijah asked, his calm tone laced with menace. "Because I have witnesses. Video evidence. And a whole community ready to speak out against you." Matheson looked at Rousseau, desperation in his eyes. "Captain, you can't seriously." "I can," Rousseau interrupted. "And I will. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending an internal investigation. Turn in your badge and gun." Matheson's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "You're going to ruin me over this?" "Over him?" he shouted, pointing at Elijah. "No," Elijah said, standing. "You ruined yourself. I'm just making sure you face the consequences." Matheson stood, his fists clenched. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, but the weight of the situation finally sank in. He unholstered his gun, placed it on the desk, and then slammed his badge down beside it. "This isn't over," he hissed at Elijah before storming out. Elijah didn't flinch. He turned to Rousseau. "I'll be following up on the investigation. And if I find out there's any attempt to sweep this under the rug, there won't be," Rousseau said, his tone resigned. "You have my word." Elijah nodded and left the office, his step steady but heavy. He had won this battle, but he knew the fight wasn't over. Justice had been set in motion, but whether it would reach its full course remained to be seen. As he stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, he pulled out his phone and called Amara. "It's done," he said when she answered. "What's done?" she asked, her voice cautious. "He's off the streets," Elijah said. "For now." "For now." Elijah paused, his jaw tightening. "We're not finished yet, Amara. Not until he answers for everything he's done." And as he hung up, Elijah knew the next steps would be even more challenging. But for the first time, Amara felt a spark of hope. Matheson sat in the dimly lit bar, his third glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. The once confident smirk he wore so well had vanished, replaced by a tense, faraway look. He was spiraling, and he knew it. The humiliation of being suspended, the whispers in the precinct, the disdainful glances from his colleagues, all of it was eating at him. His entire career, his reputation, and the authority he'd taken for granted were crumbling beneath him. A buzzing sound pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced at his phone. It was a text message from a number he didn't recognize. "You think this is over? It's just getting started." He froze, his hand tightening around the glass. It didn't take long to guess who was behind it. Jones. That smug FBI agent had been the architect of his downfall, the man who turned the tables on him in front of Rousseau. Matheson clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He couldn't let this happen. He wouldn't. Elijah sat in his home office, scrolling through documents and emails on his laptop. The investigation into Matheson's history was progressing faster than he had anticipated. Witnesses were coming forward, emboldened by the news of Matheson's suspension. Complaints that had been buried for years were resurfacing, painting a damning picture of systemic neglect and abuse. The phone on his desk buzzed. Elijah picked it up, his brow furrowing at the unknown number. He answered, his voice steady. "Jones. You think you've won, don't you?" Matheson's voice came through, sharp and venomous. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanging. "I don't think. I know." There was a pause, then a bitter laugh from the other end. "You're so righteous. Always fighting for justice. But tell me, Agent Jones, how many times have you bent the rules to get what you want?" Elijah's voice dropped an octave, his calm now ice cold. "You called me to deflect? That's weak, Matheson. But I guess that's fitting." "This isn't over," Matheson spat. "You can dig up all the dirt you want, but you'll never get me behind bars. I've got friends in high places. People who know how to make problems disappear." "You're the only problem here," Elijah replied. "And no one's disappearing anything this time." There was another pause, filled with static and tension. "You've made this personal," Matheson said finally, his voice low. "And that was a mistake." Elijah's grip tightened on the phone. "No, Matheson. The mistake was yours the moment you thought you could get away with hurting my daughter." The line went dead, but the conversation lingered. Elijah placed the phone down, his jaw set. He had dealt with men like Matheson before, arrogant, entitled, and dangerous. But this wasn't just about protecting Amara anymore. It was about dismantling the system that allowed men like Matheson to thrive. At school, Amara was trying to settle back into her routine, but the weight of everything that had happened still loomed over her. She caught snippets of conversations in the hallways, people talking about what had happened at the cafe. Some supported her, outraged by Matheson's actions. Others whispered cruel things, questioning why she hadn't just stayed quiet. During lunch, she sat with her best friend Tasha, who was scrolling through her phone. "You've seen this, right?" Tasha asked, turning the screen toward Amara. It was a news article with the headline, "FBI Agent Exposes Misconduct in Local Police Department." Below it was a picture of Matheson, looking disheveled and angry as he left the precinct. Amara sighed, pushing the phone away. "Yeah, I've seen it. This is a good thing, Amara," Tasha said, her voice firm. "He's finally being held accountable." "Is he, though?" Amara asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "He's suspended, sure. But what if nothing changes? What if this is just another story people forget in a week?" Tasha placed a hand on her arm. "Your dad's not the kind of man who lets things slide. You know that." Amara nodded, but the knot in her stomach didn't loosen. She couldn't shake the feeling that the worst wasn't over yet. That evening, Elijah met with a local journalist who had been covering police misconduct for years. Her name was Simone Carter, and she had a reputation for fearless reporting. "Thanks for meeting me," Elijah said as they sat down in a quiet corner of a coffee shop. "I should be thanking you," Simone replied, pulling out a notepad. "This story has the potential to blow the lid off a lot of things." "I'm not doing this for headlines," Elijah said firmly. "This is about accountability. Not just for Matheson but for everyone who enabled him." Simone nodded, her pen poised. "What's your next move?" Elijah leaned forward, his voice low. "I want to expose the network. Matheson isn't acting alone. There are people protecting him, covering for him. If we don't dismantle that, nothing changes." Simone's eyes lit up with determination. "Then let's get to work." Meanwhile, Matheson was pacing in his small apartment, his mind racing. The walls seemed to be closing in, the shadows creeping closer with every passing hour. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "It's me," he said when the line picked up. The voice on the other end was calm, almost amused. "Greg. Didn't think I'd hear from you again." "I need help," Matheson said, his voice cracking. That FBI guy, he's ruining me. I need this to go away. There was a pause, then a chuckle. You always were good at making messes. Fine. I'll see what I can do. Matheson exhaled, a sliver of relief washing over him. But deep down, he knew he was running out of time. Elijah returned home late that night, exhaustion etched into his face. Lisa was waiting for him in the living room, her arms crossed. Amara's worried, she said. And so am I. Elijah sighed, sitting down beside her. I know this is hard. But it's necessary. I'm not saying it isn't, Lisa replied, her voice softening. But this is taking a toll on all of us. On you. Elijah looked at her, his expression unyielding. I can handle it. Lisa reached for his hand. Just promise me you won't let this consume you. Promise me you'll come back to us when it's over. Elijah squeezed her hand, his resolve unwavering. I promise. But even as he said the words, he knew the road ahead would test every part of him. What came next would push him, and everyone involved, to their limits. And he wasn't sure if they were ready for what was about to unfold. The precinct was buzzing with tension the day after Matheson's suspension. Whispers of the investigation spread like wildfire, and officers who had long turned a blind eye to his behavior were now wondering if they might be implicated too. The atmosphere was thick with unease, and every conversation seemed to pause when Elijah entered the room. Elijah wasn't there to exchange pleasantries. His goal was clear: uncover every piece of evidence tying Matheson to the systemic misconduct that allowed him to operate unchecked. Armed with Simone's growing exposé, he approached Russo with more demands. Captain Russo, Elijah began as he closed the door to the office behind him. We need access to the internal complaint files, everything related to Matheson and any officer who's been involved in covering up his actions. Russo sighed, rubbing his temples. Jones, do you know what you're asking? This department's reputation is already on the line. If those files go public, that's exactly the point, Elijah interrupted, his tone unwavering. This isn't about saving face. It's about accountability. And if you think this ends with Matheson, you're mistaken. Russo stared at him for a long moment, the weight of the situation evident in his furrowed brow. Finally, he nodded. Fine. But you better have a plan for what happens next. Elijah left the office, feeling the weight of the files Russo had reluctantly handed over. Each document painted a picture of a department riddled with complicity, a web of silence and excuses that had protected Matheson for years. Elijah's mind raced as he thought about how to dismantle it. Meanwhile, Amara was trying to navigate the aftermath of her father's actions. At school, the lines had been drawn. Some of her classmates treated her like a hero, while others, kids with parents in law enforcement, viewed her with open hostility. The tension came to a head during a group project in history class. You must feel real proud of yourself, said Jake, one of her classmates, as they worked on the assignment. His tone was thick with sarcasm. Amara looked up, confused. What are you talking about? Your dad, Jake sneered. Ruining a good cop's career just because you couldn't handle a little discipline. Amara's hands clenched into fists under the table. Discipline, she repeated, her voice low. What Matheson did wasn't discipline. It was abuse. Jake leaned back in his chair, smirking. Whatever helps you sleep at night. Before Amara could respond, Tasha intervened, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. You don't know what you're talking about, Jake. Maybe if you spent less time defending bad cops and more time paying attention in class, you'd actually learn something. The teacher called for order before the argument could escalate further, but the incident left Amara shaken. She realized that her fight wasn't just with Matheson, it was with a system and a mindset that saw people like her as less than. And that fight wasn't going to be easy. That evening, Elijah received a call from Simone. Her voice was electric with excitement. Elijah, I've got something. What is it? He asked, leaning forward in his chair. A whistleblower, Simone said. One of Matheson's former partners. He's willing to go on record about the cover-ups. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. When can we meet him? Tonight, Simone replied. But there's a catch. He's afraid for his safety. If word gets out that he's talking to us, we'll protect him, Elijah said firmly. Set it up. A few hours later, Elijah and Simone met the whistleblower, Officer Caleb Howard, in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town. Caleb was young, barely in his 30s, with a nervous energy that made him glance over his shoulder every few seconds. Thanks for meeting with us, Elijah said, his tone reassuring. I know this isn't easy. Caleb nodded, his hands fidgeting with the edge of the table. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Matheson, he's done things I can't live with. But it's not just him. The whole system's rotten. I filed complaints, so did others, but they always got buried. Do you have proof? Simone asked, her pen hovering over her notepad. Caleb reached into his jacket and pulled out a USB drive. Everything's on here. Emails, internal memos, even audio recordings. Elijah took the drive, his grip firm. You're doing the right thing, Caleb. This could change everything. But Caleb's eyes were haunted. Yeah, he said quietly. If it doesn't get me killed first. The next day, Elijah presented the evidence to Russo, who paled as he listened to the recordings. One in particular, a heated argument between Matheson and another officer, laid bare the extent of the corruption. You've got him, Russo admitted, his voice heavy. And probably half the department with him. Then it's time to clean house, Elijah said. But as they prepared to move forward, word of the investigation leaked. It wasn't long before Elijah received another call, this time from Matheson himself. You think you're a hero, don't you? Matheson growled. But heroes don't win, Jones. The system's too big for you. You're right, Elijah replied calmly. The system is big. But so is the truth. And it's coming for you. Matheson laughed, a cold, bitter sound. We'll see about that. The call ended, but the threat lingered. Elijah knew Matheson wouldn't go down without a fight. And with the whistleblower's safety on the line, the stakes had never been higher. As the investigation intensified, the community began to take notice. Protests erupted outside the precinct, demanding justice not just for Amara but for every victim of police misconduct. Amara attended one of the protests with Tasha, standing in the crowd as chants of accountability now filled the air. For the first time, Amara felt a sense of power, a realization that her voice mattered. She looked around at the sea of faces, each one a testament to the strength of a united community. And she knew, no matter how hard the fight, they wouldn't back down. Back at home, Elijah was preparing for the next steps. The evidence was solid, the witnesses were ready, and the momentum was building. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Matheson had one last card to play. And as the night fell over the city, that card was about to be revealed. The whistleblower's revelations sent shockwaves through the precinct. Officer Caleb Howard's recordings and documents weren't just a damning indictment of Matheson, they exposed a culture of complicity that extended far beyond him. By midweek, Russo had no choice but to launch a department-wide review. Officers who had once turned a blind eye to Matheson's behavior now found themselves under scrutiny, and the fear rippled through the station like a slow-moving storm. Elijah spent his days coordinating with Simone and legal teams, preparing for what would be the most high-profile case of his career. At night, he returned home to Amara and Lisa, doing his best to reassure them even as the weight of the fight bore down on him. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Elijah's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. Is it Matheson again? Lisa asked, her voice laced with worry. No, Elijah said, setting the phone down. It's Simone. She's got an update. Amara looked up from her plate, her eyes filled with curiosity and concern. What's happening now? Elijah hesitated, then leaned forward. The story's going live tomorrow. Simone's running the exposé with all the evidence Caleb gave us. Once it's out, there's no turning back. Lisa's expression tightened. And what about Matheson? What happens when he sees it? Elijah met her gaze, his voice steady. If he reacts the way I think he will, it'll only make our case stronger. The next morning, the city woke to the headlines splashed across every major news outlet, "Inside the Shield, exposing a culture of corruption." Simone's article didn't pull punches. It detailed Matheson's pattern of misconduct, the systemic failures that allowed him to operate unchecked, and the brave whistleblowers who had come forward to reveal the truth. The public reaction was immediate. Social media lit up with outrage and calls for accountability. Protesters gathered outside the precinct in even greater numbers, their chants growing louder and more insistent. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Officers avoided eye contact, their conversations hushed. Matheson, however, was nowhere to be found. Elijah's phone buzzed as he stepped into his office that afternoon. It was Russo. "We need to talk," the captain said, his voice clipped. "Where's Matheson?" Elijah asked, already suspecting the answer. "That's what I need to talk to you about," Russo said. "He didn't show up for his meeting with Internal Affairs this morning. We think he's gone into hiding." Elijah's jaw tightened. "He's desperate. That makes him dangerous." Russo sighed heavily. "I've got units out looking for him, but I wanted to give you a heads up. Watch your back." "Always do," Elijah replied before hanging up. He turned to find Amara standing in the doorway, her expression cautious. "Is everything okay?" she asked. Elijah motioned for her to sit down. "Matheson's gone underground," he said. "But don't worry. The police are looking for him." Amara frowned, her voice low. "Do you think he'll come after us?" Elijah hesitated, then shook his head. "He's trying to save himself. He doesn't have time for anything else." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that Matheson wasn't done with them yet. That night, as Amara sat in her room scrolling through her phone, a notification popped up, "New message request." The sender was anonymous, the profile picture blank. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it. "Your father's lies won't protect you forever. You're just as guilty as he is for ruining my life." Amara's heart raced as she read the words. She immediately ran to Elijah's office, thrusting the phone toward him. "Look at this," she said, her voice shaking. Elijah read the message, his expression hardening. He placed a hand on Amara's shoulder. "It's him." "What do we do?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. Elijah stood, his calm demeanor masking the storm inside him. "We don't give him what he wants. He's trying to scare us." "But what if he won't," Elijah said firmly, cutting her off. "I promise you, Amara, I won't let anything happen to you." Amara nodded, though the fear in her eyes didn't fade. The following day, a break in the case came unexpectedly. Caleb Howard called Elijah, his voice trembling. "He called me," Caleb said. "Matheson. He wants to meet." Elijah's grip on the phone tightened. "Where?" "An abandoned warehouse near the old shipping yard," Caleb replied. "He said if I don't show up, he'll make everything worse, for me and for you." Elijah's mind raced. It was a trap, but it might also be their best chance to end this. "Don't go," he said. "I'll handle it." "No offense," Caleb said, his voice shaky, "but you're not exactly on his good side either." Elijah smiled grimly. "That's exactly why I have to go." That evening, Elijah arrived at the warehouse alone, his FBI badge tucked into his jacket. The area was dark and eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of distant traffic. He stepped inside, the creak of the old wooden floorboards echoing through the cavernous space. "Jones," a voice called out, sharp and cold. Elijah turned to see Matheson emerge from the shadows, his face lined with anger and desperation. He held a gun, its barrel pointed at the ground but his grip tense. "You've really made a mess of things for me," Matheson said, his voice low and venomous. "No," Elijah replied, his tone steady. "You made a mess of things for yourself. I just brought it to light." Matheson laughed bitterly. "You think you're some kind of hero? All you've done is destroy my life. You destroyed your own life the moment you decided the law didn't apply to you," Elijah said. "And now you're running from the consequences." Matheson raised the gun slightly, his hand trembling. "You don't know what it's like," he said, his voice cracking. "You don't know what it's like to be hated for doing your job." "Your job was to serve and protect," Elijah said, stepping closer. "But all you've done is harm the people you were supposed to protect. And now you want pity? You won't get it from me." For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension between them like a live wire. Then Matheson's arm dropped, the gun hanging loosely at his side. "You think you've won," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "But this doesn't end with me. The system's bigger than both of us." Elijah nodded, his expression grim. "You're right. The system is big. But change starts with one step." Matheson laughed again, bitter and hollow. "You're a fool, Jones." "Maybe," Elijah said. "But at least I'm not a coward." The words hit their mark, and for a moment, Matheson looked like he might snap. But instead, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the shadows. Elijah let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his body tense but his resolve unbroken. The fight wasn't over, but one thing was certain, Matheson's days of running were numbered. And Elijah would make sure justice caught up to him. Elijah stood in the warehouse for a moment longer, the shadows swallowing Matheson's retreating figure. The cold air nipped at his face, but his focus was elsewhere. His instincts told him this wasn't the end. Matheson's bitterness and desperation made him volatile, a man with nothing left to lose. Elijah's work wasn't finished, in many ways, it was just beginning. He exited the warehouse cautiously, scanning his surroundings for any signs of an ambush. The empty streets felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Sliding into his car, he locked the doors and quickly dialed Russo. "It's me," Elijah said as Russo picked up. "Matheson's still out there. He's not planning to turn himself in." Russo groaned on the other end. "We've got officers combing the area, but he's slippery. If he called you out there, he probably planned his exit." "He's desperate," Elijah said, his voice firm. "That makes him dangerous. You need to widen the search perimeter and notify the press. Someone in the community might spot him." "You're giving him too much credit," Russo replied, his tone tired. "He's just a disgraced cop trying to save his skin." "No," Elijah said sharply. "He's a cornered animal. And you know what they do when they feel trapped." Russo sighed heavily. "Fine. I'll make the calls." Elijah hung up and leaned back in his seat, his thoughts racing. He'd faced men like Matheson before, men whose entitlement and arrogance blinded them to their own flaws. But Matheson's anger felt different. It was more personal, more dangerous. As he drove home, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Simone. "I heard you met with Matheson," she said, her voice tense. "I didn't tell you that," Elijah replied, frowning. "You didn't have to. Word travels fast in this city, especially when it involves someone like him," Simone said. "What happened?" "He's not ready to surrender," Elijah said, keeping his voice even. "But he's unraveling. It's only a matter of time before he slips." Simone paused, then asked, "Do you think he's a threat to you? Or to your family?" Elijah gripped the steering wheel tighter. "He's already made threats. I'm not taking them lightly." "Neither should you," Simone said. "I'll keep digging on my end. If there's anything I can use to pressure the department into prioritizing this manhunt, I'll find it." "Thanks, Simone," Elijah said. "Be careful. Matheson's desperate enough to lash out at anyone he thinks is against him." "Always am," she replied before hanging up. When Elijah got home, the house was quiet. Amara was in her room, and Lisa was on the couch, her laptop open on her lap. She looked up as he walked in, her expression a mix of relief and worry. "You're late," she said. "Had a meeting," Elijah replied, shrugging off his jacket. "With Matheson?" Lisa asked, her voice sharp. Elijah froze, then sighed. "How did you know?" "Amara told me about the message he sent her," Lisa said, closing her laptop. "Elijah, what are you doing? Meeting with him alone? You're putting yourself in danger." "I had to," Elijah said, sitting down beside her. "It was the only way to gauge what he's planning." "And?" Lisa pressed. "He's running scared," Elijah said. "But he's not done fighting." Lisa's face tightened with worry. "This isn't just about Matheson anymore. It's about you, and me, and Amara. He's dragging all of us into this." Elijah placed a hand on hers. "I know. But I'm not going to let him hurt us. I promise you that." Lisa searched his face, her eyes softening. "Just don't forget what's at stake, Elijah. We're your family. Don't lose yourself in this fight." "I won't," Elijah said, his voice steady. "But I can't walk away either." The next morning, Amara sat at the breakfast table, scrolling through her phone as Malik chattered about his science project. She wasn't really listening. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the message Matheson had sent her. It felt like a shadow hanging over her, a constant reminder that the danger wasn't over. "Earth to Amara," Malik said, waving a hand in front of her face. "Sorry," she said, forcing a smile. "What were you saying?" "I was asking if you could help me with my poster tonight," Malik said. "I want it to look really cool." "Sure," Amara said, ruffling his hair. "Anything for my little brother." Elijah walked into the kitchen, dressed for work but clearly preoccupied. He kissed Lisa on the cheek and poured himself a cup of coffee. "Are you going to the precinct today?" Lisa asked. "No," Elijah said. "I've got a meeting with Simone. We're strategizing the next steps." Amara looked up. "Next steps for what?" "For keeping the pressure on," Elijah said. "The more exposure Matheson gets, the harder it'll be for him to hide." Amara hesitated, then asked, "Do you think he's still watching us?" Elijah's expression softened. "If he is, we'll be ready. You don't need to worry about him." But Amara wasn't convinced. The unease in her chest refused to fade. That evening, Simone called Elijah with an urgent update. "We've got a lead," she said. "Someone spotted Matheson near a motel on the edge of town." "Did they call it in?" Elijah asked. "Yes," Simone replied. "But here's the catch, he left before the cops got there. The motel clerk said he looked agitated, like he was planning something." Elijah's heart sank. "Planning what?" "Don't know yet," Simone said. "But if he's desperate enough, it can't be good." Elijah ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "I'll notify Russo. He needs to increase patrols in the area." "Do it fast," Simone said. "This feels like a ticking clock." Elijah ended the call and immediately dialed Russo. After explaining the situation, Russo agreed to deploy more officers near the motel and surrounding neighborhoods. "Jones," Russo said before hanging up, "if you hear anything else, call me. We're stretched thin, but we'll get him." You better, Elijah replied, his voice firm. As the night deepened, Amara sat at her desk working on Malik's poster when her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, expecting a text from Tasha, but her stomach dropped when she saw the message. You think you're safe? You're not. None of you are. Her breath caught in her throat. She ran out of her room, nearly colliding with Elijah in the hallway. What's wrong? He asked, catching her by the shoulders. It's him, Amara said, holding up her phone. He sent another message. Elijah read the words, his face hardening. That's it. We're not waiting for him to make the first move. What are you going to do? Amara asked, her voice trembling. Elijah looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. I'm going to end this. Once and for all. And as he walked away, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was coming next would change their lives forever. Elijah paced the dimly lit precinct, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. Russo's voice on the other end was tense but resolute. We've got him, Russo said. A patrol car spotted Matheson's vehicle abandoned near the old train depot. Units are closing in now. Elijah's chest tightened. I'm heading there. Jones, wait, Russo interjected. This is police business now. You've done your part. This stopped being just business the moment he came after my family, Elijah snapped, already grabbing his keys. I'm not sitting this out. The line went dead, and Elijah was out the door. The train depot was cloaked in darkness, its rusted structures looming like forgotten relics of a bygone era. Officers surrounded the perimeter, their flashlights cutting through the shadows as they searched for Matheson. Elijah arrived, flashing his badge as he passed the barricade. You shouldn't be here, Russo said, approaching him. I'll take my chances, Elijah replied, his eyes scanning the scene. What's the status? We're closing in, Russo said. He's holed up somewhere inside. Before Elijah could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the night, a gunshot. The officers froze, their radios buzzing with frantic chatter. That came from the east wing, one of them shouted, and the team sprang into action. Elijah didn't wait for permission. He followed the sound, his heart pounding as he navigated the maze of rusted beams and crumbling walls. The air was thick with tension, every shadow a potential threat. As he rounded a corner, he spotted a faint light flickering in one of the rooms. He approached cautiously, his footsteps silent. Inside, Matheson was pacing, his face contorted with anger and desperation. He held a gun, its barrel swinging wildly as if he couldn't decide where to aim. Papers and maps were strewn across the table, a haphazard plan that had clearly fallen apart. It's over, Matheson, Elijah said, stepping into the doorway. Matheson whirled around, his eyes wild. Stay back. Elijah raised his hands, his voice calm. You don't want to do this. Don't tell me what I want. Matheson shouted, his grip on the gun tightening. You ruined me. Took everything I had. You took everything from yourself, Elijah said, his tone steady. All I did was hold up a mirror. Matheson's laugh was bitter, hollow. Spare me the lecture, Jones. You don't know what it's like, working your whole life, only to have it ripped away. What I know, Elijah said, stepping closer, is that you had power. You had responsibility. And you chose to abuse it. That's on you, not me. Matheson's hand trembled, the gun wavering as if his resolve was breaking. You think this makes you better than me? You're just another guy with a badge, pretending to be a hero. I don't need to be a hero, Elijah said, his voice softening. I just need to stop you from hurting anyone else. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of Elijah's words hanging in the air. Then Matheson let out a strangled cry, dropping the gun to the floor. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence as Russo and the officers arrived. We've got him, Russo said, nodding to his team. As Matheson was handcuffed and led away, he glanced back at Elijah, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and resignation. "This isn't justice," he muttered. "No," Elijah said, watching him go. "But it's a start." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of headlines and hearings. Matheson's arrest was just the beginning. Simone's exposé had ignited a firestorm, and the internal review uncovered a web of corruption that implicated several officers and even some local officials. The precinct underwent a complete overhaul, with Russo leading the charge for reform. Caleb Howard, the whistleblower, testified against Matheson in court, his bravery earning him both praise and scrutiny. He was eventually transferred to a new precinct, where he hoped to start fresh. For Amara, the ordeal left a lasting mark, but it also ignited something within her, a determination to fight for change. She joined a local advocacy group, using her voice to speak out against injustice. Her confidence grew with each step, and her relationship with her father deepened as they shared stories of resilience and hope. Elijah returned to his work at the Bureau with renewed purpose. The case had taken a toll on him, but it had also reaffirmed why he'd chosen this path. He was more determined than ever to hold people like Matheson accountable and to be a source of strength for his family. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Amara looked at her father and smiled. "You know," she said, "I used to think justice was something that just happened. Like if you waited long enough, the bad guys would get what they deserved." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "And now? Now I know it doesn't work that way," Amara said. "Justice isn't passive. You have to fight for it. Every day." Elijah smiled, pride evident in his eyes. "You're absolutely right." The story of Elijah, Amara, and Matheson wasn't just about one man's fall from grace. It was about a community standing up against injustice, about the power of truth and accountability, and about the strength it takes to confront the systems that enable harm. What do you think? Should justice always come at a cost, or is it worth fighting for no matter the price? Share your thoughts in the comments below, we'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us here at Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and reveal the unexpected. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.